My dad messaged, "Don't come to the Thanksgiving dinner. It's for actual family." I simply responded, "Understood." Then I silently stopped paying the rent. 2 weeks later, the bank summoned. Their apartment was in default, and I awoke to 23 missed calls. I, 31M, never thought I'd be writing this. But here I am at 2 a.m., staring at my phone screen with 23 missed calls from my father. Let me start from the beginning. My relationship with my dad has always been complicated. After my mom died when I was 16, he remarried within a year to a woman who made it clear I wasn't welcome in their new family dynamic. She brought 2 kids from her previous marriage, and suddenly, I went from being his son to being an inconvenience. I moved out at 18 and worked my way through college, building my life from scratch. Fast forward 13 years, and I've done well for myself. I'm a software engineer at a major tech company, own my own place, and have been quietly successful. What my dad doesn't know, what nobody in my family knows, is that I've been the one paying the rent on their apartment for the past 3 years. It started when I overheard my stepmother complaining to a neighbor about their financial struggles. My dad's construction business had taken several hits, and they were behind on rent. Despite everything, I couldn't watch him get evicted. So I contacted their landlord anonymously and set up an arrangement where I'd cover the rent through a management company. They never knew it was me. The text message came on a Tuesday evening while I was finishing up a project deadline. My phone buzzed, and I saw my dad's name. We rarely communicated beyond obligatory holiday greetings, so I was curious. The message was short and brutal. He told me not to come to Thanksgiving dinner because it was for actual family. He said I'd made it clear over the years that I didn't consider them family, so why pretend now? The words hit harder than I expected. After everything I'd quietly done to keep them afloat, this is what I got. I stared at that message for a long time. My finger hovered over the keyboard as I considered various responses. I could tell him about the rent payments. I could unleash years of built-up resentment. Instead, I typed one word, "Understood." Then I did something that felt surprisingly liberating. I opened my banking app and canceled the automatic transfer that had been going to their rent for 36 months straight. 3 years of secretly covering their housing costs, over $60,000 of my own money, and this is how he talked to me. The first week passed quietly. I went about my normal routine, worked on my projects, hit the gym, grabbed drinks with friends. Occasionally, I wondered if I was being petty, but then I'd remember his words. Actual family. The phrase echoed in my head whenever doubt crept in. By the second week, I'd almost forgotten about it entirely. Then came Thanksgiving morning. I was planning to spend it alone, maybe order some takeout, and catch up on work. Instead, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. The first call was from my dad. I let it go to voicemail. Then my stepmother called, also ignored. Then my step-siblings started calling. I turned off my phone and went for a long run, trying to clear my head and figure out what was happening. When I finally turned my phone back on around noon, the missed call count was staggering. 23 calls from various family members. The voicemails told the story I'd been expecting, but somehow still wasn't prepared for. My dad's first message was frantic. He said they'd received an eviction notice and were trying to figure out what happened. The landlord had told them their rent hadn't been paid in 2 weeks, and they were confused because they thought it was being handled automatically. The second voicemail was from my stepmother, crying and asking if I knew anything about their rent situation. She mentioned that the landlord had said something about payments coming from a management company that had suddenly stopped. By the fifth message, my dad's tone had shifted. He was angry now, demanding I call him back immediately. He said the landlord had mentioned that someone had been covering their rent anonymously for years and had recently stopped payments. The later messages became increasingly desperate. My stepmother was begging me to call back. My step-siblings, who had barely acknowledged my existence in recent years, were suddenly very interested in talking to me. The final message was from my dad, and his voice was different, quieter. He said he'd figured out what had happened and needed to talk to me urgently. I sat in my kitchen, listening to these messages while eating leftover Chinese food, and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Part of me wanted to call back immediately and fix everything. The other part remembered every slight, every time I'd been excluded, every family gathering where I'd felt like an outsider in my own father's house. Instead of calling back, I decided to wait. If they wanted to reach me, they could drive to my apartment. I wasn't going to make this easy. Around 4 p.m., There was a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw my dad standing there alone, looking older and more tired than I remembered. I debated not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the door, he looked genuinely surprised to see me. He asked if we could talk, and I stepped aside to let him in. We stood awkwardly in my living room for a moment before I gestured for him to sit on the couch. He started by apologizing for the text message. He said he'd been under a lot of stress and had taken it out on me unfairly. Then he asked directly if I had been the one paying their rent. I confirmed that I had been, and his face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, guilt, and something that might have been relief. He wanted to know why I'd done it without telling them. I explained that I'd overheard them discussing their financial problems years ago and couldn't stand the thought of him being homeless, regardless of our relationship. I told him I'd set it up anonymously because I didn't want them to feel obligated to me or change how they treated me out of guilt. He asked why I'd stopped, and I reminded him of his text message. I told him that if I wasn't actual family, then I shouldn't be responsible for actual family's rent. The conversation that followed was probably the most honest we'd had in years. He admitted that he'd been a terrible father after my mother died, that he'd let his new wife dictate the family dynamics, and that he'd been too proud to acknowledge how much I'd been helping them. He explained that his business had been struggling more than I knew, and that without my rent payments, they were facing eviction within days. The management company had called the landlord when my payments stopped, revealing the arrangement I'd kept secret for 3 years. I told him I understood their situation, but that I was tired of being treated like an outsider while secretly keeping them afloat. I said I'd spent years hoping things would change between us, but his text message had made it clear they never would. He broke down then, admitting that he'd been wrong about everything. He said losing my mother had made him shut down emotionally, and he'd handled his grief by creating distance between us. He acknowledged that his new wife had encouraged that distance and that he'd been too weak to fight for our relationship. I felt my own walls starting to crack as I listened to him. This was the conversation I'd wanted to have for 13 years, but it was happening only because he needed something from me. He asked if there was any way I could help them through this crisis, promising that things would be different moving forward. He said he wanted to rebuild our relationship and that he was ready to set boundaries with his wife about how I was treated. I told him I needed time to think about it. The hurt from years of exclusion wasn't going to disappear because of one conversation, no matter how genuine it seemed. He nodded and said he understood. Before he left, he mentioned that they'd told the rest of the family about my rent payments, and everyone was shocked. My stepmother wanted to apologize, and my step-siblings were apparently feeling guilty about how they'd treated me. After he left, I spent the evening thinking about everything that had happened. Part of me wanted to rush in and save them immediately, but I'd learned the hard way that enabling behavior doesn't lead to lasting change. Update 1. The next morning, I made my decision. I called the landlord and offered to pay the overdue rent under certain conditions. First, my dad would need to sign a formal lease acknowledging that I was a co-signer and had equal say in housing decisions. Second, any future family gatherings at their apartment would include me, or I would stop payments again. Third, my stepmother would need to apologize directly for years of exclusion and commit to treating me as family moving forward. The landlord was happy to work with me since I'd been such a reliable payer in the past. I covered the overdue amount and first month going forward, but made it clear this was temporary while they figured out their long-term situation. My dad was incredibly grateful when I called to tell him what I'd done. He agreed to all my conditions without hesitation and said he'd already started having difficult conversations with his wife about their treatment of me. The apology from my stepmother came that evening. She called me crying, admitting that she'd been threatened by my relationship with my dad and had actively worked to create distance between us. She said she'd been jealous of the bond my dad and I had shared before she came into the picture and had convinced herself that pushing me away was necessary for her own family's stability. It wasn't the apology I'd expected, but it felt genuine. She asked if we could start over and promised that things would be different. Update 2. 3 weeks later, I received my first invitation to a family dinner that didn't come with conditions or last-minute cancellations. It was awkward at first. Years of tension don't disappear overnight, but it was a start. My step-siblings, who were now adults with their own problems, seemed genuinely remorseful about how they'd treated me growing up. They admitted they'd followed their mother's lead in excluding me and hadn't questioned whether it was right. The most surprising change was in my dad. He was making a visible effort to include me in conversations and family decisions. When my stepmother started to revert to old patterns during dinner, he shut it down immediately, something he'd never done before. I'm still cautious about trusting these changes completely. 13 years of hurt doesn't heal in a few weeks, and I'm not naive enough to think everything will be perfect moving forward. But for the first time since my mother died, I feel like I might actually have a family again. Update 3. It's been 6 months now since that Thanksgiving text message changed everything. The rent arrangement has evolved into something more sustainable. My dad's business has recovered enough that he's covering most of it himself, with me helping during slower months. More importantly, our relationship has continued to improve. We have lunch every other week now, just the two of us, slowly rebuilding the connection we lost when I was 16. He started sharing stories about my mother that he'd never told me before, and I'm learning things about their relationship that help me understand his grief better. My stepmother and I will probably never be close, but we've reached a functional level of mutual respect. She includes me in family planning now and has stopped the subtle comments that used to make me feel unwelcome. The most unexpected development has been with my step-siblings. My stepbrother recently asked me for career advice since we work in similar fields, and my stepsister invited me to her graduation party. These might seem like small gestures, but they represent a fundamental shift in how I'm viewed within the family structure. Looking back, I realized that my decision to stop paying the rent wasn't really about revenge, even though that's how it felt at the time. It was about finally setting a boundary and demanding the respect I deserved. Sometimes people need to face consequences before they're willing to change, and my family was no exception. The missed calls that woke me up that Thanksgiving morning weren't just about panic over eviction. They were the sound of people finally realizing what they'd been taking for granted. My silent support over the years had enabled them to maintain their dysfunction while still benefiting from my help. I don't regret the 3 years I spent secretly covering their rent. It was something I needed to do for my own peace of mind, knowing I'd tried to help despite our problems. But I also don't regret stopping those payments when I did. It forced conversations that were long overdue and created an opportunity for genuine change. The relationship I have with my dad now isn't the same as what we had when I was a kid, but it's something new and potentially stronger. We're both adults who've made mistakes, and we're working together to build something better. That text message about actual family still stings when I think about it, but it also served as a wake-up call for everyone involved. Sometimes the most painful truths lead to the most necessary changes. Today, I finally feel like actual family again, and this time it's because we all chose to make it that way. The 23 missed calls turned out to be the beginning of getting my family back, even if it didn't feel that way at the time. Sometimes the best revenge is simply stopping the cycle that allowed people to take you for granted, then being open to genuine change when it comes.